Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about something that I know you're really interested in, digital storytelling in education. And we've got a lot of really interesting material to dig into, articles and some course instructions, even some stuff from an education website, like a whole digital library.
Yeah, there's a lot here. And,
Let's,
digital storytelling, it's really interesting to see how it's developed over time. It's not just about using technology, it's about harnessing something really powerful,
hmm
like narrative and combining that with multimedia elements.
Yeah, and I used to think digital storytelling was this really high-tech thing that you needed all this fancy software. But looking through this stuff, it sounds like you can do it simply,
Mhm.
like even with PowerPoint.
It's funny you should say that because, yeah, I mean, digital storytelling really is about finding the tools that work best for you and for your purpose. It can be as simple as a slideshow or, something really complex like a full-blown animated film. It's about matching your approach to your audience and also your learning goals.
That's really interesting. Looking at all this material, one of the things that stood out to me is that it looks like digital storytelling can be traced back to the late 1980s with this guy named Joe Lambert and something called the Center for Digital Storytelling.
Yeah, Joe Lambert. He was one of the pioneers of the field. He was really fascinated by how average people could create powerful stories when given access to technology. It was really about giving everyone a voice,
Wow.
then democratizing the whole idea of storytelling. And it's really amazing to see how accessible those tools are today and how that spirit of democratization has kind of continued.
Our sources mentioned something that the Center for Digital Storytelling developed called the Seven Elements
Oh, yeah.
as a framework for digital stories.
Yeah.
What do you think about those elements? Like what makes a good story
Yeah.
in this medium?
The seven elements are a great place to start. They cover everything from point of view, whose story is it and why are they telling it? And then the dramatic question, what is it that keeps people engaged? One element I think that's particularly powerful in education is emotional content.
I can see how that would be really important. Because it's one thing to learn facts and figures, but if you connect to a story emotionally, it's going to stay with you.
Right. Just imagine like a student learning about immigration history by reading a textbook versus like experiencing it through a digital story, told by an actual immigrant. That personal connection makes it come alive in a way that just reading facts and figures can't.
So it sounds like digital storytelling can go beyond those personal narratives as well, though, right? Our sources talk about using several major categories of digital stories in education.
Definitely. There are historical documentaries and stories that inform or instruct. Like one source talked about a project where students took Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and they used archival photos and music from that time period to create a digital story about the Civil War. And I mean, think about that. That's something that could be a dry history lesson, but they made it into this like really immersive experience.
That's a great example. What about the stories that inform or instruct? Can you give an example of one of those?
Yeah. One that stuck with me was this digital story explaining the Pythagorean theorem. So they used visuals demonstrating the concept and then a student narrating the formula. And they even included real-world examples to show how it's applied. That's like a really cool way to learn math.
So it sounds like there are benefits for both teachers and students.
hmm
What are some of the ways teachers can use these?
Oh, there are so many ways. Teachers can use digital storytelling to introduce new material, to make those abstract concepts that we were talking about, like the Pythagorean theorem, to make them really concrete, and also to spark discussion. Imagine you're a teacher and you could start a unit on, let's say, the solar system, not just with a lecture, but with a digital story,
Yeah.
with great visuals and maybe some dramatic music, and a really interesting narration. I mean, wouldn't that make you want to learn more?
It sounds like it would. And for the students creating the stories themselves, what are they learning in the process?
Well, they're definitely developing some tech skills, but they're also learning a whole bunch of other things, like how to research and how to write well and how to organize information and visual literacy and digital literacy. And the list goes on and on.
That makes me think about this whole idea of 21st century literacy,
Yeah.
where it's about being able to navigate and create in this digital world.
It's a perfect example of that because you're not just passively taking in information, you're actually creating something. And you become like a producer of knowledge rather than just a consumer. It's pretty empowering.
Okay, so let's get practical for a minute. How do you actually go about creating a digital story? Like, what are the steps involved?
Well, our sources outline a pretty clear process. You start by choosing your topic. And doing your research, of course, and then thinking about your purpose, like who is your audience and what do you want them to take away from the story?
So once you've done all that, then comes the creative work, right?
Yeah.
Like writing the script and mapping it all out.
Right. The script is like the backbone of the story. It's where you flesh out the narrative, you give your characters a voice, and then you create the storyboard, which is like a blueprint for the story. It's a way to visualize how the story will flow and plan your shots and make sure everything works together.
So the storyboard is kind of like a dress rehearsal before you start bringing in all the multimedia stuff.
Exactly. It's your chance to experiment with the pacing and the visual transitions and make sure the story has the emotional impact that you want it to have.
So you've got your story, your storyboard,
Mm-hmm.
and then comes the fun part, right? Bringing in all those images, audio and video. Our sources really emphasize the importance of high-quality images. Why do you think that is?
Well, think about it. If you're telling a story about, I don't know, the Grand Canyon, don't you want the pictures to show how amazing it is, how big it is? You want to pull people in, and a blurry picture just wouldn't do that, would it?
It makes a big difference.
Hmm.
So how do you find those high-quality images?
Well, one way is to encourage students to take their own pictures, using digital cameras. That way they learn about photography and they have control over how things look.
That's a great idea. But I imagine that's not always possible, so what do you do then?
Well, there are websites that offer royalty-free images and images that are in the public domain. You just have to be resourceful. And of course, make sure you're not breaking any copyright laws. And sometimes the best pictures are the ones you already have. Like if you're telling a family story, you might have old photos that would be perfect.
Yeah, that personal touch can be really powerful. So images are one thing, but what about audio? Music and sound effects must be really important for digital stories.
Yeah, they totally are. Audio can make you feel different emotions, like set the mood. Think about like a suspenseful scene, like in a mystery. Don't you think some scary music would make it even more intense?
Definitely. It's like the music becomes part of the story too. But how do you choose the right sounds and music so it doesn't become too much?
Well, you want to make sure that it matches the story. Like if you're telling a funny story, you probably want music that's upbeat and happy. If it's a sad story, you probably want something slower and more serious.
What about sound effects?
Sound effects are great for making a story feel more real, and sometimes for adding humor or for emphasizing certain parts of the story. Like if you're telling a story about a city, you could use sounds of traffic and sirens to make it feel like you're really there.
You don't want to just throw in a bunch of sounds for no reason though, right?
Right. It should add to the story, not distract from it.
Okay, so we've got our pictures, we got our sounds. What about the voiceover? That's got to be really important for telling the story, right?
Oh, definitely. The voiceover is like the narrator. It's what guides you through the story. You want it to be clear and engaging.
Our sources mention using a good microphone. Is that really necessary? Can't you just use the one on your computer?
Well, you don't need fancy equipment, but using a decent microphone can make a big difference in how your voice sounds. It just sounds more professional.
Okay, so you've got your microphone. What else can you do to make a great voiceover?
Well, practice helps a lot. Read through your script a few times before you record. That way you know what you're going to say and you can get the pacing right.
And I guess even if you practice, everyone makes mistakes, right? So what about editing?
Oh, editing's important. You can use it to clean up your recording. Take out any mistakes and make sure the sound flows smoothly.
So the last step is adding titles and captions and things like that, right?
Those are like the finishing touches. The titles introduce the story, the captions give you more information, and the credits tell you who made the story and where the pictures and music came from. It makes it look professional and polished.
It really is amazing how many things go into making a good digital story.
Yeah, it is. It's like you're weaving together all these different elements to create something special.
So now that we've talked about how to create a digital story, let's talk about how to share them.
You have so many choices these days. You could put it on a website, or share it on YouTube or Vimeo, or even send it to a film festival.
So for our listeners, what are the main things they should remember from this part of our discussion?
I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're making deliberate choices about your topic and your pictures and music and everything. And think about who you're making it for and what you want them to learn. And have fun.
I love that. And before we move on to the next part of our discussion, I want to ask you a question. If you were to create a digital story, what would it be about?
That's a great question to think about. And we'll talk more about that in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be right back.
We'll be back soon to explore some of the challenges and research in the field of digital storytelling. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive.
Hmm.
Before the break, I asked you to think about what story you'd tell if you were to make a digital story. Did any ideas pop into your head?
It definitely got me thinking. But even once you have a good story idea, there's still all the practical stuff to figure out. Our sources had some good tips on that, like starting with choosing a topic, doing research, figuring out your purpose and audience. Yeah, it's kind of like, you know how when you're building a house, you need a blueprint. You wouldn't just start building without knowing what you want, right?
Right.
It's kind of the same with digital storytelling. You need to have a plan and know what you want to say and who you want to say it to.
And that's where the scripting and storyboarding come in, right?
Exactly. That's where your story starts to, really take shape. The script is like the foundation. It's where you flesh out all the details and give the characters their voices, and you figure out the tone of the story. Like, is it going to be funny, serious, informative?
And the storyboard is like a visual map.
Exactly. You sketch out all the scenes before you even start thinking about pictures and music and all that. It's like a roadmap to make sure that your story flows well, especially if you're working with students.
And once you have a script and storyboard, then it's time to start gathering all the multimedia stuff, right?
Yeah.
All those images, audio, and video.
That's when it gets really fun. I mean, you can use just about anything, photos, drawings, music, sound effects, even video clips.
Our sources really stressed using high-quality images. Why is that so important?
Well, let's say you're doing a story about, I don't know, the ocean. You want people to see how beautiful and amazing it is, right? So you need good pictures that show all the details and colors. If you use a blurry picture, it just won't have the same effect.
Yeah, it's like the difference between watching a movie on a small screen versus a huge high-definition screen.
Hmm.
The quality of the images just makes a difference. So where do you even start looking for high-quality images?
Well, one idea is to have students take their own pictures,
Hmm.
with digital cameras. That way they learn about photography. And they get to choose exactly how they want things to look.
That's a great way to get them involved.
Yeah.
But what if that's not an option?
Well, there are lots of websites that offer royalty-free pictures or pictures that are in the public domain. You just have to do a little digging. And of course, make sure you're following all the copyright rules. And you know what? Sometimes the best pictures are the ones you already have. Like if you're doing a family story, you could use pictures from your photo albums.
That's a really cool idea. So images are one thing, but what about the audio side of things? Music and sound effects. I mean, they can really add a lot to a story, can't they?
Yeah. Audio can make you feel all kinds of emotions. It sets the mood. Like if you were watching a scary movie, think about how the music makes it even scarier.
Totally. But how do you choose the right music and sounds so it doesn't get too overwhelming?
Well, the trick is to pick music and sounds that fit the story.
Mm.
If you're telling a light and funny story, you probably want upbeat music. And if it's a serious story, you might want something a bit slower and more dramatic.
What about sound effects? When do you use those?
Sound effects are really good for making a story feel more real, or for adding humor, or for making certain moments stand out. Like, let's say you're doing a story about a big city. You could use sounds of traffic and people talking to make it feel like you're actually there.
It sounds like the important thing is to use them in a way that enhances the story, not distracts from it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so images and sounds, we've talked about those. Now, what about the voiceover, the narration? I mean, that's a big part of digital storytelling, right?
It is, definitely. It's the voice that kind of guides the listener through the story. It's like having a narrator right there with you.
Our sources mentioned that it's important to use a good microphone for recording voiceovers. Is that something you need to worry about, or can you just use the one on your computer?
Well, you don't need to go out and buy some fancy microphone or anything, but having a decent microphone will make your voice sound much clearer, and it just makes it sound more professional.
So what else makes for a good voiceover, besides having a good microphone?
Practice. Practice helps. Read through your script a few times before you actually record it. That way you know what you're going to say, and you can get the timing right.
And even if you practice, people still make mistakes, right? So what about editing?
Oh, editing's really important. You can cut out any mistakes and make sure that the sound flows nicely.
So the last things to add are titles and captions and things like that.
You got it. Those are the final touches, The icing on the cake. The titles introduce the story. The captions give people more information if they need it. And the credits tell you who made the story and where they got all the pictures and music from.
And that's all part of being professional and giving credit where credit is due.
Right.
It's amazing how many different pieces there are to making a good digital story.
It is. It's like putting together a puzzle, you know? All the pieces have to fit just right.
So we've talked about making a digital story. Now, what about sharing it?
You can do so many things. You can put it on a website, share it on YouTube or Vimeo, even send it to a film festival.
It's really cool to think about all the ways you can share these stories with people. So before we move on, what are some of the key things you would want our listeners to take away from this part of the conversation?
I'd say the most important thing is to really think about what you're doing. Make choices about your topic, the pictures, the music. Think about who your audience is, what you want them to learn. Oh, and don't forget to have fun.
I like that. And before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to ask you something. If you were going to create a digital story, what would you make it about?
That's a good question to think about. And actually, we'll talk more about that in the next part of our deep dive.
We'll be right back to discuss the challenges and opportunities in digital storytelling. Stay with us.
Welcome back, everyone. In this last part of our deep dive, we're going to be looking at some of the challenges and some of the research around digital storytelling.
Yeah, even though we've talked about all the cool stuff you can do, there are always things to be aware of, like copyright, for example. Our sources mention that quite a bit. It's easy to accidentally use stuff that you're not supposed to.
Especially, I would think, for students. They might not really understand all the ins and outs of copyright law.
That's right. And it's important to teach them about it so they learn how to use media responsibly.
Our sources mention some strategies for avoiding copyright problems. What are some of the things that teachers can do? Well, one thing is to have students create their own stuff, like take their own pictures instead of getting them online. That way there's no question about copyright. And it gets them to be more creative.
Yeah. It turns a problem into an opportunity to learn something new. So what if you can't create everything yourself? What are some other options?
There are websites that have royalty-free images and stuff, and things that are in the public domain. You just have to make sure you're giving credit where credit is due, even when you're allowed to use something for free.
It's about teaching those good habits from the start, right?
Exactly.
One of the other challenges that our sources brought up was the idea of bad storytelling.
Mm.
Like, you can have all the fancy multimedia, but if the story itself isn't good, it's not going to work.
Yeah. It's like, imagine you're building a house, and the foundation is all messed up. It doesn't matter how pretty the outside is. The house is still going to fall apart.
So how do you make sure students are telling good stories?
Well, the most important thing is the script. That's the heart of the story. Spend time working on that. Make sure there's a good message and interesting characters, and a plot that keeps people engaged.
So the multimedia comes after the story is solid.
Right. And as a teacher, you can help them with that. Give them feedback, make suggestions, help them to make their stories the best they can be.
That's really valuable. Now, our sources also talked about research in digital storytelling. They said there's a need for more studies to really figure out how it works in education.
Yeah, we can see that it's helpful, but we need to be able to prove it and figure out how to use it in the best possible way.
What are some of the questions researchers are trying to answer?
Well, they're looking at things like, how can we use digital storytelling to show that students are learning deeply? And how can we use it to assess what they know? And they're also trying to understand how it can help students who learn in different ways.
So it sounds like there's still a lot to learn.
Definitely. And as technology keeps changing, there will be even more to discover.
So as we finish up here, what are some of the key things you want our listeners to remember about digital storytelling?
Well, first of all, it's not just a gimmick. It's a really powerful way to help students learn and express themselves. And it's about bringing together stories and technology and creativity to make something really amazing.
And it's not just about the finished product. It's about the process of making it. Learning new skills, working together.
That's a great point. And I would just say to everyone listening, give it a try. If you have a story to tell, digital storytelling is a great way to do it.
It's a way to share your voice with the world. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into digital storytelling.
It was my pleasure. And until next time, keep learning and keep telling your stories.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic.